first 1,000 days are terribly important, the most important part of a person's life. And what happens in those early 1,000 days has determining effects on the rest of the life. We've always known that. Now it's sort of official, but we have always known. And I will talk, in my first talk now, about protein in the first 2 years. I will first make some remarks about stunting. Even though I have no personal research experience, I will relate to you the findings of some recent studies and bring you good news. Good news is that stunting is receding everywhere in the world it has been looked at. It's going back. It's still there, but it's going back. And then I will tell you about some new developments in Europe and the United States, where we now are concerned about some infants and toddlers receiving too much protein, with the possibility that this may program them for obesity later in life. So with that introduction, let me show you. I have to show you this. My university requires me to tell you this, but I speak on behalf of other companies. This is Iowa, not exactly in the middle, but close to the center of the United States. The borders of the state are not straight like those of other states. The borders are made on the west by the Missouri River, and on the east by the Mississippi River. So Iowa is wedged between two big rivers. And since the end of the Ice Age, Iowa has been covered by prairie, which is the reason why there is very, very good deep soil. And so it is a very good agricultural land, and we grow maize, usually in record amounts per hectare. This maize right now is all brown and is being harvested. We feed it to pigs and cows to make meat and milk, and we convert it to syrup as a sweetening agent, and increasingly we convert it to ethanol that we put in our tanks of our cars. So much about our Iowa's economy. Too little is bad. Too much can be bad too. That can be said of many things. I will now speak to the fact that too little protein is bad, and too much protein can be bad. The first 1,000 days of life, as you just heard, a period of high vulnerability to nutritional deficiency and possible excess. High vulnerability. Why is the vulnerability so high? It's because of the rapid growth. Anytime you have very rapid growth, and that applies especially to the premature infant, anytime you have very rapid growth, there is great vulnerability for permanent effects if that rapid growth cannot be realized. The consequences of impairment in those first 1,000 days are potentially lifelong. So stunting, we call stunting the impairment of linear growth during childhood. It is associated with adverse health and developmental outcomes, and you all know that. In low mature settings, linear growth faltering begins early in the first year of life and progresses through 24 months. After that, there is very little additional stunting. It all happens in the first 2 years of life, which also means that any preventive measures must concentrate on the first 2 years of life. Nutrition is one, and I emphasize one, important and potentially modifiable factor, with low protein intake being the main problem. And I say being the main problem because it is probably not just protein, it is probably not just nutrition, but these are important components and they're potentially modifiable. We grade stunting into mild if the height z-score is less than -1, graded as moderate if it's between 1 and 2, or between 2 and 3, and severe if it is less than -3. That's height for HD score. I show you this graph for two reasons. One is to honor Kenneth Brown and then Catherine Dewey, who created it. But the other is to emphasize that as the infant, receives breast milk as the sole source of its nutrients for the first 4 to 6 months, the beginning, somewhere around 4 months, 4 to 5 months, special transitional foods or complementary foods are being added, and those add nutrients, and as the infant consumes more and more complementary foods, the amount of breast milk that is produced and consumed by the infant declines. That is well documented. As soon as their complementary foods are introduced, milk production decreases, milk consumption decreases. After these special transitional foods, follows a period when the infant increasingly just consumes what the rest of the family eats. But I'd like to emphasize that the complementary foods are in addition to breast milk. They're not replacing breast milk. Now, the role of nutrition in stunting, here are some facts that I've summarized here. Infants eat for calories. And since infants eat for calories, if the food that they eat has a low protein content, they will receive a low protein intake. As complementary foods displace breast milk, the composition of these foods becomes important. And in low-resource countries, the complementary foods tend to be plant-based with very little animal products. And herein seems to be the main problem of stunting. As I say here, often cereal-based, low in protein, and it happens to be also low in iron. Anything that makes a food low in protein also makes it low in iron, which I will talk about later. The role of nutrition in stunting is generally described as a lack of animal protein. The same lack causes low iron intake. There is also, very commonly, a lack of micronutrients, which may have the same source as the lack of protein, namely animal products. And there could be a lack of calories, but that seems to be a far distant third cause of stunting. I'd share with you the results of this very important study that was published by Gretchen Stevens with all her collaborators. That describes recent trends in mild, moderate, and severe stunting and underweight and progress towards the MDG1 in 141 developing countries. A systematic analysis, population representative data. So the data for 141 developing countries were analyzed. The data were grouped into groups of countries, as I will show you. What they show is that the trends in height Z-scores and weight Z-scores, I could also say HIZ and WIC, between 1985 and 2011 of children aged less than 5 years of age. There were data for 141 developing countries. And the findings are summarized here, and I will show you some graphic findings too. The mean height Z-score improved from 1.6 in 1985 to, from negative 1.86 to negative 1.16 in 2011. So a substantial increase in the degree of stunting. The prevalence of stunting, moderate to severe, declined from 47% of 5-year-olds to 30%, a substantial decline. But in 2011, there were still 314 million children who were stunted of all degrees. 314 million children. This is a graphic display of the decrease in stunting. This is stunting a moderate and moderate degree. And again from 1985 to 2011. And what you see is that there's been a decrease everywhere, with the exception of sub-Saharan Africa, which is the light green where there was actually an increase over the period of reporting. All other areas showed a decrease in stunting. This is stunting among less than 5-year-old children. This shows the same thing. Decrease almost everywhere with the exception of a few isolated areas. Now here, it's shown in a different way. It shows the percentage of infants in this curve. The dotted line here is the WHO median. And here you see Central Asia, Middle East, and North Africa grouped together. And the progression from 1985 to 2011 is from left to right. And you see that during all periods that they analyzed, there was a decrease in the degree of stunting. A complete elimination of stunting would mean that the curves follow the WHO. They don't do that yet. So there is still stunting, but it is less over this 26-year period. This shows it for South Asia, where the degree of stunting is more severe, but at the same time, the improvement has been more substantial than in other areas. That's why I show you this area, to see how much it improved, but it still has a long ways to go to reach the WHO standard of weight for age growth. So the conclusions from this important study were that on average, anthropometric status has improved in developing countries in the past 26 years. There were major differences across regions and countries, as I pointed out. Impressive improvements in Asia, Southern and tropical Latin America, and Caribbean were made. In Oceania and Sub-Saharan Africa, however, there was stagnation. Now, a comparable important study is the one published by Linda Adair. In this study, they looked at associations of linear growth, that is degree of stunting, and relative weight gain during early life with adult health and human capital in countries of low and middle income. Findings from 5 birth cohort studies. In 5 countries, there were complete records of studies where people were followed from birth into adulthood. And these data they analyzed. 5 prospective birth cohort studies from Brazil, Guatemala, India, Philippines, and South Africa. The data were available for 8,362 subjects. The outcomes of interest were adult height, BMI, blood pressure, plasma glucose, and, importantly, years of schooling attained. Because years of schooling stands as a substitute for cognitive accomplishment. Childhood is divided into 0 to 2 years, 2 years to mid-childhood, and childhood into adulthood. And here are some of the results. Birth weight was associated with greater adult BMI and height and with more attained school years. Hence, the great importance of birth weight. It justifies every effort to increase birth weight. As you all know, it is very difficult to increase birth weight, but it is worth the effort because the bigger you are at birth, the greater the attained number of school years. This is an important realization that birth rate has such an important long-term effect. Faster linear growth, less stunting, was associated with greater adult height and more years of schooling, but also with increased blood pressure. So we have the situation that we can say less stunting, better height growth in early childhood. It's the first 2 years that really matter. Leads to better cognitive outcome measured as years of schooling. But also a price, namely a high blood pressure. But we cannot equate that with hypertension, but the blood pressure on average is higher. Early growth was not related to dyslipidemia, so no matter what happened early in life, there was no increased risk of diabetes. This graph sort of summarizes the important findings, I think. What you see is, it says here, change in completed years of schooling, per standard deviation change in conditional growth variables. Now they use this term conditional relative weight. You can forget that. Just this is weight and this is height. And what you see is that as weight improved, as birth weight improved, there was an increase in the number of years of schooling. We already said that. As weight improved, age 2 years, milk child, not much happened. Not much effect on years of schooling. But if height improved, especially in the first 2 years of life, this is height in the first 2 years of life, an increase or higher, better height gain was associated significantly with more years of schooling. So we can say better height growth in early childhood leads to improved cognition measured as improved numbers of schooling. At mid-childhood, there's still a significant effect indicated by the average, but the effect is not nearly as high as for the first 2 years of life. So that is the most vulnerable period where it matters the most. Okay, now stunting in meat consumption. Since lack of meat is thought to be crucial as causation of stunting, meat supplementation was expected to improve linear growth. A large study was undertaken, with funding from multiple sources. And the results were published by Nancy and Krebs and her collaborators. And I show you these results because it is such an important study, but the outcome of the study was terribly disappointing. I show you the results of the study again when I talk about iron, but from the standpoint of protein, here is what the study was. It involved rural communities in the Congo, Pakistan, Guatemala, Zambia. It used a cluster randomized design. There were over 1,000 subjects that were randomized to receive one of the two interventions. There was not a control group that received nothing. The intervention was given from 6 to 18 months, so that's a long period, 12 months. One intervention was lyophilized beef, 30 grams per day for the first 6 months, and then 45 grams per day, which is a substantial amount of meat. The cereal group received a specially made cereal that consisted of rice and soy flour. And the soy flour may have contributed a substantial amount of protein. Plus, these micronutrients, iron, zinc, copper, selenium, and magnesium, and 10 vitamins. Children received 20 grams per day for the first 6 months and then 30 grams per day. These supplements were delivered to the homes and distributed and consumed, as best one can tell, by the subjects themselves. But of course, there is some dilution into the brain that the family is always possible. Now here are the results. As far as growth is concerned, because the primary aim here was to reduce stunting. Here is length for age Z-score. The cereal group and the meat group, they're essentially identical. And that's why I said this was a very, very disappointing outcome. There was no effect of the meat on the degree of stunting. You also note that at 6 months, there was already a considerable degree of stunting, minus 1.3. So these children were already stunted when they entered the study. But during the study, there was no difference between the groups. They ended the study at 18 months, stunted to a minus 1.7, 1.8 degree. The meat supplement had no effect on the degree of stunting. We have to say, of course, we don't know how these children would have done without any intervention, because even the cereal intervention provided calories, provided some protein. But as far as being able to say more meat will prevent stunting, this study does not provide support for that. I'll show you later these results of the iron status. So, I'm trying to show you the summary. Stunting was already quite severe at study entry at 6 months, as I pointed out. Stunting progressed during the study period. Children receiving meat did not perform better than infants receiving the cereal. Perhaps Both perform better than untreated children. There were no controls, so we don't know how untreated children would have done. Can stunting be prevented? Well, we don't have experimental evidence. We have the evidence that it is getting less severe everywhere it has been followed, but we cannot say that we know how to prevent it. But we still think that improving the amount of protein in the diet is the way to go. Although poor diet is just one factor, I think we still should make every effort to improve protein intake, despite the disappointing results of the study. So much about stunting. Can protein be too much? Now I will tell you the opposite story. What can happen if protein intake is too high during a vulnerable period? I'll first tell you how much protein infants need. How do we know it? Well, we have looked at the intake of the breastfed infant, and this is a reminder that the protein content of the breast milk of normal, healthy women is high in the first month and decreases over the next 2 to 3 months and levels out after about 3 months. That's the normal course. And Mother Nature apparently knew that the protein need of the babies is higher in the first month, the first 2 months, and that's why the protein content is higher. The protein intake, indicated here in grams per kilogram per day, follows the protein concentration pretty closely. The protein requirement, calculated by the factorial method, uses the body composition of the fetus and of the infant, as indicated here. This is the fetus. Fetus here. This is the term infant out to 9 months. By the way, the same method has yielded very useful data regarding the protein requirements of the rapidly growing premature infant. But for the term infant, from here on out, we can derive by the factorial method, by converting and factoring in inevitable losses in urine and in stool, it comes out that the required intake for a premature infant, indicated here, is about 4 grams per kilogram. And the same method applied to term infants gives us the protein requirement indicated here in grams per kilogram per day against age up to 6 months here. And if we superimpose the two, the protein intake of the breastfed infant and the protein requirement calculated by this method, they're superimposable. So we're pretty sure that the truth that the average protein intake and the average protein need are in this area, starting at 2 grams per kilogram and ending at 6 months at about 1 gram. So a decrease of about 50%. Dewey and her colleagues went a step further and provided a measure of variation to this, and they called it the upper level that's indicated in green here as the safe level. So that is the level of protein that will meet the needs of 97% of normal infants. We can convert this to grams per 100 calories, which we have done. We can now say that we have a good idea about the protein needs of infants. The protein needs are decreased appreciably in the first 3 months of life. The protein intakes from breast milk match estimated requirements quite closely. What about formula-fed infants? That's indicated in this next graph here. The formulas that we have in the United States typically have 2.1 grams per 100 calories. In Europe, there are some formulas with 1.85. Inevitably, the protein levels in the formulas have to be high enough to meet the needs of the infant when they're highest, that is in the first 2 months. But because the protein level in the formula is fixed, once the protein needs of the infant have decreased, the formula provides more protein than the baby needs. That gets worse as the needs of the baby drop. Now we have other formulas, especially in Europe, follow-on formulas, and I'll tell you more about these. So, but the long and the short is that formula-fed babies most of the time receive more protein than they need, and that is because the formula content of the formula is fixed. So, the greater intakes of protein explain the greater, faster growth of formula-fed infants. They take in more energy also, which explains the greater degree of fat loss. So, it's widely understood or widely known that formula-fed babies grow a little faster than breastfed babies. Protein seems to induce a greater intake of energy, and that is shown in many studies. How important that is, I don't know, but somewhat faster growth of formula-fed infant is always seen wherever it's been looked at. Now, what about older infants? Once the babies get to be past 6 months, what do we know about them? Here is one study from Germany where they looked at the protein intake of older infants and found them to be quite high. You see here? And getting higher as the infant gets older. Is that only in Germany? This is Denmark. Look, 2.6, 2.7 average. Denmark. And we have one from the US, which I'm showing you, but one from Sweden, about 4 grams per kilogram per day of protein were consumed at 12 months. So we have to ask first, where does all this protein come from? And the answer is, it's from cow's milk. Babies are increasingly given cow's milk to drink as the main beverage as they're weaned from the breast. Formula is also involved. And meat probably only to a very small degree, but meat is a contributor of protein intake in older infants. Now, why is that of concern? Well, several older studies have shown associations between protein intake and BMI in adults and in children. And this led Roland Cacharat to examine protein intakes in a group of children that she had followed. And she looked at protein intakes of 2 years and found that those with the highest protein intake were the most obese at 6 years. That was a very new finding. It was startling, but everybody, or those who have looked since, have confirmed it. So it is indeed true. A young child, 1-year-old, I'll show you, or 2-year-old, the more protein they eat, the more likely they are to be obese at 5 years, 6 years. So she formulated in the protein adiposity hypothesis, which states that high protein intake in early life is associated with obesity later in life. She formulated this hypothesis in 1995. Here are some of the studies that have found similar things. In this study from Iceland, protein intake at 9 months was related to BMI at 6 years. In another study, it's a similar thing. In an Italian study, protein intake at 12 months was related to overweight at 5 years, and in a German study, protein intake at 12 months related to BMI at 7 years. So we have these studies, which are observational studies, which do not establish causality, but it is true that children who eat a lot of protein in the latter part of the first year of life tend to be obese later on in life. Now, all these were observational studies. But then came this study, the European Childhood Obesity Project, which was a prospective randomized study. And you all know the data from a prospective randomized study are the ultimate evidence. This study was conceived with the idea of studying the effect of lowering the protein content in follow-on formulas, which in Europe at that time were quite high. I'll show you data. The idea was to see whether lowering the protein content would still lead to adequate growth. This was a large multicentric study. 1,138 formula-fed infants enrolled before 8 weeks and randomized to one of the 2 protein levels and fed these formulas for the first year of life, entire first year of life. And there was an observational group of 619 breastfed babies. The primary endpoints were weight and height at 2 years, but follow-up to 5 years was planned. Here is the enrollment, the numbers. The infants were started on an infant formula, in this case with a protein content of 1.8, but when they reached 5 months, they were switched to a follow-on formula. Same for the high protein from 3 to 4.5, and I show you the same thing graphically. Remember this curve, this is the protein need expressed in grams per 100 calories. The low protein group received this much protein, and then it increased somewhat to this level, 2.2 grams per 100 calories for the whole first year of life. The high protein group started at 2.8 and went to 4.4. Now this is very high protein intake, but this is how the formulas were in Europe, and they wanted to know what happens if we lower the protein level from this to this. Here's what they found. Protein intakes was measured by questioning the parents, and was significantly higher at all points up to 12 months, which is when the feeding of the high protein formula stopped. But the surprising thing is the growth of these babies. What you see here is weight z-scores. Here's the breastfed reference group, following, well, all babies are smaller than the WHO, which is an artifact from the way the WHO curve was constructed. But the two formula-fed groups were significantly higher in weight and remained higher to 12 to 24 months. And the high protein group, indicated by the gray line here, were significantly heavier than the babies who received the low protein. And both groups were heavier than the babies, the breastfed babies. This was a startling finding. At least it was startling to me. I'm sure it was startling to the investigators too. Here is the BMI. Again, significantly higher in both formula-fed groups, but significantly higher in the high protein group compared to the lower protein group at 12 months, and persisting significantly different at 2 years. What happened in the 5-year follow-up? You see here the 5-year follow-up. What you see are the 3 curves. This is down here is the 50th percentile, and you see there's no difference really. The 90th percentile, the gray line is the breastfed babies. They were lower here, the 90th percentile, but out here, the high protein group, the babies who received, the children who received high protein formula as infants, the 90th percentile is taking off, and so is the 95th percentile, indicating that there are obese children among those. They're not all obese, it's a minority. Here in the next graph I show you the percent that were considered obese. Among the breastfed 3.6%, among the lower protein 5.2%, and among the higher 10.5%. Twice as many as with the low protein were obese at 5 years. And this is a stunning, as far as I'm concerned, stunning result, and I'm sure it was stunning for the investigators, because they started out by trying to show that the lower protein content was okay, and instead they find that the high protein intake led to increased obesity. And that's what we have today. The high protein intakes during infancy led to increased adiposity in infants. Increased adiposity persists into childhood in a minority of subjects. It's not all subjects, it's a minority. I still don't know who the children who ended up obese, who they were as infants. I would like to know. Were they fast growing? Were they big already when they were born? All these things I don't know. But it is clear that a minority of subjects respond to a high protein intake with obesity in mid-childhood. So, the conclusion has to be avoidance of high protein intakes in infancy appears to reduce the risk of later obesity. It seems that only a minority of infants benefit from protein lowering. Big infants perhaps, infants whose mother is obese, And we know that from another study where a similar change in protein concentration led to differences in growth only in the big babies and the babies of an obese mother. Prudence would dictate that we should reduce protein intakes of all infants. Those who do not benefit at least suffer no harm. So it seems very clear that we can lower the protein content of protein intake safely. The main targets should be milk. Now, I'm going beyond this formula study. We know that high protein intakes are mainly due to milk consumption. So I think, and we have done that in the United States, I think we should eliminate or reduce the consumption of milk by older children. Perhaps we should include complementary foods also in our efforts to reduce protein intakes of infants. Perhaps infants at high risk of later obesity, large babies are growing fast already, infants of obese mothers should be specially targeted for interventions. These are questions that I'm throwing out. I don't know the answers. And I thank you for your attention.